I have some handouts for later. That's why I've got them over here. Because, you know, if I leave you with marching orders, I have to also give you a handout. All right. For me, poetry is the liturgy of ethical culture, and I think many of you feel that way as well. So I start with a reading from Markings by Dag Hammarskjöld. Thus it was, and he wrote this in 1925. I am being driven forward into an unknown land. The pass grows steeper, the wind colder and sharper. A wind from my unknown goal stirs the strings of expectation. Still the question, shall I ever get there? There where life resounds, a clear, pure note in the silence. 20 years later, he wrote, to preserve the silence within amid all the noise, to remain open and quiet, a moist humus in the fertile darkness where the rain falls and the grain ripens, no matter how many tramp across the parade ground in whirling dust under an arid sky. When I was in 6th grade, I learned about the United Nations. And although he had died the year before, Dag Hammarskjöld's impact was very much felt by my teacher. I too became inspired, and even as I grew up and became critical of the United Nations, I have maintained a deep respect, indeed a love, for this international body. And because I think so many of us, if you're like me, enter into a topic or an organization or institution that seems so huge and difficult to get your arms around that we can enter through an individual, my insight into the United Nations was with Dag Hammarskjöld. He lived from 1905 and died tragically in 1961. When the first Secretary General of the United Nations, Trevelyan, announced his resignation in November 1952, negotiations ensued to find his successor. Someone, it was hoped, who would focus on administrative issues and refrain from politics. Hammarskjöld's reputation at the time was, in the words of a biographer, Emery Kellen, that of a brilliant economist, an unobtrusive technician, and an aristo-bureaucrat. And the Soviet permanent representative found him harmless. So there was little controversy in his nomination. Even the US State Department scrambled to find out who he was, and they authorized Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. to vote for him after he declared that Hammarskjöld was, he may be as good as you can get. So on March 31st, 1953, the Security Council voted 10-1, recommending, the one was an abstention, which they expected from China, to recommend Hammarskjöld as the Secretary General. And the vote was conducted in secret. So Dag was unaware that his name had even been put forward. Hence this exchange on April 1st, 1953. Journalists calling him, "We understand you've been designated Secretary General of the United Nations." Dag Hammarskjöld, "This April Fool's Day joke is an extremely bad taste. It's nonsense." It took a couple of more calls before he believed it. And once the Swedish mission in New York confirmed his nomination, and a communique from the Security Council was delivered to him, and after consulting with the Swedish cabinet and with his father, Hammarskjöld accepted the nomination, and he sent this wire to the Security Council. With strong feeling personal insufficiency, I hesitate to accept candidature, but I do not feel I could refuse to assume the task imposed on me should the United Nations General Assembly follow the recommendation of the Security Council by which I feel deeply honored. And you get in that sense of, even though he was considered a prodigy by so many, and was the youngest, he was only 47, that he felt honored to do this. His second term, he was unanimously reelected. So imagine this, he's taking over a secretariat of about 4,000 people. He draws up a set of regulations, very aristo-bureaucratic, of all the responsibilities of the international organization. And in the 6 years after his first major victory, which was when he personally negotiated the release of American soldiers captured by the Chinese in the Korean War, he was involved in struggles on 3 of the world's continents. He approached all of them with what he called preventive diplomacy. He was a mensch. I mean, this is a guy who made sure that he met everyone. He had lunch in the cafeteria at the United Nations. He traveled around the world to meet everyone. He also did a lot to establish more independence and effectiveness in that role of Secretary General. And out of these crises came procedures and tactics that were new to the United Nations, especially in the case of having a UN presence in terms of the peacekeeping force. Now we know later there were some issues with that peacekeeping force, but he was the first to establish that. And he was the executive for operations for peace. He had to deal with a lot, and he faced the greatest criticism in dealing with the Congo. That was the last crisis for him, and his plane was shot down in September 1961. There are still investigations going on as to whether that was an accident or an assassination. We may never know. As one of his biographers, Brian Urquhart, said, more than anyone else before or since, Hammarskjöld put the United Nations on the map as a vital guardian of the peace. He made it a potential force in its own right, especially in terms of crisis, something that deeply disturbed hardline nationalists like Nikita Khrushchev or Charles de Gaulle. In 2001, speaking at Hammarskjöld's hometown, Uppsala in Sweden, the 7th Secretary General, Kofi Annan, put it this way: there can be no better rule for a Secretary General as he approaches each new challenge or crisis than to ask himself, how would Dag Hammarskjöld have handled this? So that's how I came into an appreciation through this very humble and very lonely individual. So another of his poems from 1956. Every hour, eye to eye, with this love, which sees all, but overlooks impatience, which is justice, but does not condemn if our glances mirror its own in humility. And the next year he wrote this: do not look back and do not dream about the future either. It will neither give you back the past nor satisfy your other daydreams. Your duty, your reward, your destiny are here and now. So the United Nations matters to me because I was introduced to his story. And then I learned about Eleanor Roosevelt and the adoption on December 9th, 1948 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and I was really hooked. But that's a platform for another Sunday. To answer the question of why the United Nations on its 80th anniversary should matter to anyone else, I go back to 1945. It was conceived in 1945 in the direct aftermath of World War II, and the United Nations was designed to avoid a repeat of the failures of its forerunner, the League of Nations. Its most important innovation was to embed power directly into the organizational structure by giving 5 powerful countries, China, Russia, which of course was then the Soviet Union, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, a greater voice in the organization by providing them with a veto right, right? The veto assures the great powers that actions won't be taken that violate their fundamental interests. And as a result, they're willing to participate. So you had to get buy-in, and that was the way to get the buy-in. The trade-off, providing legitimacy for small states on the one hand, right, the General Assembly, and guarantees for mightier powers on the other, was the bargain that made the organization possible. Yet, I don't need to tell you this, it simultaneously sowed the seeds of future paralysis. After all, no action can be taken if one of the 5 permanent Security Council members is not on board. So in addition to the 5 permanent, there are also 10 that every 2 years gets voted in. So like the Security Council consists of those 5 plus 10, but the 10 change. Randall Scott is a political scientist at the University of Rochester, and he said that the UN's history is studded with episodes when consensus among the Security Council's permanent members enabled real breakthroughs. And one of the earliest, and I really appreciated seeing this because so many times, we read about the scandals and the deadlocks and we just kind of despair. But again, looking back in history, I find can be helpful. One of the earliest came in Indonesia in 1947, when Dutch forces fought to recolonize the Southeast Asian archipelago. And after years of a brutal war, the UN Security Council forced a ceasefire and passed a successful resolution that demanded a Dutch withdrawal. And as Randall Stone says, the muscle behind that came from the Truman administration, which threatened to withhold Marshall Plan funds from the Netherlands if it failed to comply. But there was also a united front among the 5 permanent members. So when consensus frays, a veto looms, but on the other hand, it brings them to the table. A cooperative solution can possibly be found between those major powers. So that kind of leaves the General Assembly as a forum that has symbolic clout but little strength. Still, that influence is not trivial. All the major human rights treaties that have been adopted since 1945 started in the General Assembly. From human rights to climate change, the General Assembly has launched cooperative approaches to global problems that would not otherwise exist. So ultimately, the great powers cannot exercise their vetoes if they do not show up. They have to be there for meetings. That dialogue may not end wars, it may not stop atrocities, but it ensures that even adversaries meet, argue, and explain themselves. And sometimes keeping the dialogue alive is the most the United Nations can do. And sometimes that may be enough. Well, it's complicated. I printed this out and I'll share it with you. This is the United Nations system, teeny tiny print, different colors. I mean, it's amazing. Complex, complicated. There are different organs, the General Assembly, Security Council, Secretariat, International Court of Justice. There are subsidiary organs, there are commissions, departments. I mean, it's exhausting. And everyone has an opinion, right? So how do most people feel? What's their impression about it? I mean, I'm sure during the Q&A you'll let me know. But Pew Research Center and Gallup did polls just to find out. 80th anniversary, how do people feel about the United Nations? Well, it's generally favorable. According to Pew, and ahead of the 80th anniversary, they polled people from around the world, a survey of about 32,000 adults in 25 different countries, and they found that a median of 61% of adults have a favorable view. The opinions are particularly positive in, you might be able to guess the countries, Canada, Sweden, Germany, Indonesia, South Korea, Nigeria, Kenya. Least positive, especially these days, is Israel. In the United States, the views of the United Nations have turned more positive for the first time since 2022. This may also not surprise you. Democrats and Democratic-leaning people have a more favorable view, about 70%. What does the Gallup poll say? Gallup pretty much concurs with the Pew, and that is that Americans are broadly supportive of the United Nations as an institution and calling it necessary, as well as favoring involvement. But at the same time, only about 1 in 3 think the UN is doing a good job in solving the problems that it has to face. So kind of a mixed thing. Yes, we're glad you exist. We feel favorable towards you, but we're also very critical. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think we should be critical, and we should speak up. The bottom line of these two polls, Americans don't believe the United Nations is doing a good job, but mostly continue to support its mission and its existence, albeit at some slightly lower levels. And while Republicans tend to hold the United Nations in lower regard than Democrats, most do still want the United Nations to remain a member nation of the United Nations. There's one very strong and very loud exception to that, Donald Trump. So, on September 23rd, he goes to the United Nations. He complains about the escalator. That was his own damn fault. Complains about the teleprompter, also his fault, but whatever. Donald Trump says, "What is the purpose of the United Nations? I'm really good at this stuff. Your countries are going to hell." Right? He issues a new warning that the U.S. military would continue to play the role of judge, jury, and executioner in killing suspected drug smugglers in international waters. He undermines the scientific consensus on climate change, saying it was, quote, "made by stupid people," and is the greatest con job ever perpetrated on the world. Of course, then he turns to the topic of religion, falsely claiming that Muslim leaders in the West are planning to institute Sharia law, while claiming Christianity to be the, quote, "most persecuted religion on the planet," close quote. He made it clear that he wants little to nothing to do with the United Nations mandate. He has withdrawn from the UN Human Rights Council, cut back $1 billion in funding, and claims that the United Nations, all it does is write strongly worded letters and speak in empty words. So he was very clear what his opinion is of the United Nations. Well, what about the newish guy? He's been there since 2017. Secretary General Antonio Manuel de Oliveira Guterres. Well, he's no Dag Hammarskjöld, but he was appointed to a second term. He was born in 1949. He's Portuguese and a diplomat, and he may be the unobtrusive technician and aristo bureaucrat that they were hoping for, back in the earlier days when Hammarskjöld came along. I mean, he does have some creds, right? In 2005, Guterres was elected High Commissioner for Refugees, and he headed the world's largest humanitarian organizations, which at the end of his term had more than 10,000 staff working in 127 countries, and he was providing protection and assistance to over 60 million refugees, returnees, internally displaced people, and stateless persons. And here's where the bureaucrat comes in. His time in office is marked by a fundamental organizational reform, cutting staff and administrative costs. So, not bad. He's doing his best. He's the first national leader to become the UN Secretary General, so he has some understanding of that as well. He's faced tremendous challenges. When he first came in, they still had the unresolved issue in Haiti I don't know if you recall this, but peacekeepers from Nepal came to Haiti. They had some form of cholera. They did not clean up after themselves very well, and cholera broke out in Haiti. And the United Nations still has not made the reparations they need to make to that country. So he came in with that challenge already facing him. He also had the challenge of the sexual assault, again by peacekeepers in Central African Republic, that was exposed in 2016. So when he came in 2017, he had some challenges already ahead of him. But he decided to make that a year of peace. He said, let us resolve to put peace first. So what has Guterres done on the 80th anniversary? Well, as a bureaucrat, as a politician, UN 80 initiative. And here are its points. It calls for efficiencies, three key areas: efficiencies and improvements, mandate implementation, some 4,000 resolutions and source documents. Let's take a look at all of them. How are we doing on those resolutions? Potential structural changes, program realignments. He's got a goal to create the United Nations that's more efficient and cost-effective, more responsive to crises and countries' needs, more effective in delivery of sustainable development goals, more accountable to taxpayers and the people it serves, more supportive of UN staff. They're looking at this UN 80 as an opportunity for transformation. I mean, they have to, given all the funds that have been cut. Although they say it's not, a fund-cutting initiative, it's certainly more about efficiency still. The goal is to make the United Nations stronger, more coherent, better able to deliver on its mandates, and they're looking at it as a strategic opportunity to hold to today's priorities. And I wish them all the success in the world. Today, the United Nations assists more than 130 million displaced people, provides food to over 120 million, delivers vaccines, still, we hope to continue, to nearly half of the world's children, and supports peacekeeping, elections, climate change, and human rights around the world. It's challenging. It is beyond challenging. So, what do we do? Here's my conclusion. What do we do? Given the pros and the cons of the United Nations, the general favorable feeling, but also the critique, well, one thing is all of you are members not only of this society and the American Ethical Union, but also of our non-governmental association, the National Ethical Service. The National Women's Conference was founded in 1924, and it was a group of all the local societies, and they pulled together in 1925. They were at the U.S. conference called the Committee on the Cause and Cure of War. In 1947, the National Women's Conference, our organization, affiliated with the United Nations as the first humanist group to enter into formal association with the Department of Public Information at the United Nations. So we are an NGO at the United Nations. The name was changed in 1983 to the National Service Conference and finally accepted men. Changed the name again in 2010 to the National Ethical Service. And I am now part of that. I'm honored to be part of that. I feel like I've grown up. The girl who learned about the United Nations and Dag Hammarskjöld, and now I'm the ethical culture leader advisor to the National Ethical Service. It's a non-governmental organization associated with the United Nations Department of Global Communications, and we're part of so many different alliances at the United Nations, including the Culture of Peace. In Philadelphia in July at the AEU Assembly, the National Ethical Service, led by Audrey Kindred, presented a resolution which was passed to reaffirm our commitment to children's rights. And all the societies agreed that they would do something to promote it. So I'm hoping that your society is doing that as well. This past Tuesday, November 18th, the National Ethical Service, New York Society, Brooklyn Society, and the NGO Committee on Children's Rights held a celebration at the New York Society, a celebration of World Children's Day, which is on November 20th, and the adoption of the convention. And so I really encourage you, and I have a handout, which I'll pass out later, to get involved with the National Ethical Service, to host an event here on children's rights, because I, as a child, learned about the United Nations. It's important that more children, I got to tell you, on Tuesday, with the auditorium, Adler Hall, filled with children, including the 5th grade of Ethnoculture School, which was quite an accomplishment to get the Ethnoculture School there. And really letting them know how important they are as children and how important their rights are. Now, sad to say, the United States is the only country in the world who has not ratified the rights of the child. So a lot of work needs to be done there. I don't expect that's going to happen with this administration. Still in all, work to be done, and I'm hoping that you will become more involved in that. I want to close with another reading from Dag Hammarskjöld. And this, this was written a couple of months before he was killed. Tired and lonely. So tired, the heart aches. Meltwater trickles down the rocks. The fingers are numb. The knees tremble. It is now that you must not give in. On the path of the others are resting places, places in the sun where we can meet. But this is your path, and it is now that you must not fail. Weep if you can, weep, but do not complain. The way chose you, and you must be grateful. Thank you. I'm grateful to all of you. And